we want to tell you about another podcast from PRX called Monumental. This podcast explores questions about the past, present, and future of U.S. monuments, uncovering the stories about what and who is important, as well as the stories that have been left out. Join host Ashley Seaford across the country with their team of journalists. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, October 21st, 1984, a presidential debate between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale, and we get one of the most iconic lines in debate history, maybe political history. Facing some tough questioning about his age and fitness to continue to serve in office, the 73-year-old Reagan says, quote, "I will not make age an issue in this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience." It's a very, very good line, and it got a very good response, and it is largely remembered as one in which Reagan kind of swept aside those questions, those big questions about his age. But it is worth revisiting just how big that fitness for office question was. I was a little surprised at some of the language and discussion around it before you get that quip at the debate. It is also worth remembering that, a couple weeks later, Reagan went on to absolutely demolish Mondale in the election, the last real blowout in U.S. presidential elections. We are certainly getting questions about age in this year's race. I don't know if we'll get the blowout in this year's race, but let's discuss here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Listeners, I think you probably realize we are very much in election mode. All of our conversations basically are topics that feel like they are from previous elections and feel like they have some resonances here. So obviously this age thing, we've discussed it. We will get into the resonances for this race. But we've touched on this a couple of times. This is the maybe iconic debate line. So there's two things I want to talk about with the line itself, which is just kind of the performance of that line and how effective it was and how it went in the room. But I also, like I said in the intro, I was a little surprised when I went back and read that, there were deep, deep, deep questions about Reagan's mental fitness. The story I feel like I often hear is that there was a little bit of this. He sort of dismisses it with this one-liner at the debate, and then it's not until later that we realize, oh gosh, in his second term, he was truly, addled and suffering.
And really, it's a legacy of the success of that quip because it does kind of wipe away the seriousness of those questions. At the time, at 73, Reagan was the oldest person to ever be nominated for president. As we all know now, he was beginning to show the signs of Alzheimer's disease. And when he goes in for that first debate, he blows it. He blows it like June 2024 blows it.
The debate we're talking about now is the second debate, and you're talking about there's a first debate performance where he really kind of blows it. Yeah.
And we've certainly seen incumbent presidents sort of fumble their first debate, but this was something different. He wasn't able to finish a thought. I think in his closing statement, he started to tell a story about when he gets in a car and is driving somewhere and he never ends up anywhere because he just loses the thread. And people are looking around and they're like, okay, well, we knew he was old, but seeing him incapable of putting together a cohesive answer and coherent thought, maybe he's in much worse shape than we thought. And that really created a problem for the Reagan campaign, because what do you do when people start to doubt your fitness for office?
Yeah. And not just your physical fitness, but your mental fitness. I think that's really important. I mean, we have had disabled presidents before, physically disabled presidents. And that's one thing I think the American public can be like, okay, he's in a wheelchair. Okay, we can sort of but you can still navigate the job. But I think when it comes to people's ability to how they think on the job, their mental well-being is everything. And, I don't think the American public just realized how deep into his mental illness he was. I mean, he was confused about what city he was in. He was having, real challenges that were really sort of hidden from the American public. But you definitely get to see a glimpse of that here. And it's troubling also because 73, today,
right.
73 is oh, you're still a spring chicken. We still
Maybe
don't
a summer
have
chicken.
These, yeah. I mean, we it's considered older for sure, but it doesn't have the same sort of stigma that we think of when you're in your 80s per se.
And adding on to this, I mean, it is the height of the Cold War. He's making comments about the military where he's discussing the defense budget, and he's saying that the reason it's so high is because of the cost of military food and wardrobe. And there had just been like 3 leaders of the Soviet Union who had died of old age in office. And it was just like, we could use some stability. What are we doing?
That food and wardrobe line is just a sort of callback to his acting days, right? He just sort of reverted to like what's on a budget, food and wardrobe, right?
The craft
like
table
catering,
and
the craft table.
Costuming.
Exactly. But Kellie, I think your point about being able to hide a physical defect, maybe, or it not being as serious. I mean, it is also worth noting, like, we're just kind of at the tail end of a media environment in which the president isn't sort of omnipresent, right? And so you don't see Reagan every single day. There aren't these questions, there aren't memes, there aren't kind of videos being snipped. And so you can kind of manage the public face of this decline. But then, of course, you get this debate. I mean, there was a review after the debate, some reporting on the debate in which it referred to Reagan, and it said he, quote, stumbled over words, mangled his own familiar stories, repeated mind-numbing statistics, rambled through his closing statement, and seemed to lose track of the rules at one point. And I really think I read exactly that same phrase in 2024, in the wake of that Biden debate. I mean, it is stunning kind of how similar that language was. So then, these questions persist. I will also say you read some of the reporting at the time coming out of this debate, and obviously these are real questions, but you also see a kind of very modern phenomenon, which is like the media's bias towards a close election and a sort of narrative. And so immediately there's all these Time Magazine is writing headlines that are like, is this now a neck-and-neck horse race, and all this stuff. And it's like, it probably never was. Reagan probably was going to win all along, but you see kind of how eager the press is to paint something as really close and neck and neck.
To sway people, too. Yeah, to sway people's opinion about how they might think of him as being fit.
Yeah, but, I think it's like, on the one hand, the questions were legit, but also he probably was going to win all along. And I think, there was less polling then than there is now, but I mean, the polling never really showed it actually neck and neck. And obviously it ends up being a blowout. But let's cut to this debate moment. I mean, Kellie, have you gone back and watched this tape? Just on in a pure vacuum, it's a pretty good line, right?
It is. It's a zinger. I mean, I think I love a good politician that can give a quick clap back. You know what I mean? That's just oh, yeah, okay, you're with it. I love a good zinger. And that it lands so well. I'm talking about his inexperience and youth. I mean, that's the number one thing that you would associate with youth is inexperience. And so it's kind of his ultimate trump card, too, when you think of what he could play, what he could say in response. Is perfect. Yeah.
Well, and it shows real confidence, too, because given how serious of a question that was, the fact that he responds to it with humor is important, right? He's not being defensive. He's going on offense, but not offensive in a mean way. He's going on offense with humor, which is his go-to move. And the thing is, if you watch the video of this moment, everyone cracks up, including Mondale. Everyone thinks it's hilarious. And you can kind of feel the energy shift in that moment. Because if Mondale can't even keep from laughing at this,
right.
Everyone's with Reagan in this moment.
Even the moderator's like, nice one, Mr. President. It's just kind of, they're patting each other on the back.
Point Reagan.
But I mean, it is really fascinating. And, it's so tricky to, do you go right into the criticism and try and, invert it in this way, or do you avoid it and move around it? Do you try and distract? And this is much more artful and clever, but it has a little element of that thing that Trump does all the time, which is basically whatever you accuse me of, I'm just going to immediately turn it around on you. I'm not going to try and deflect or ignore. I'm going to actually just kind of reframe. But this is a much more clever reframing that actually kind of moved to another substantive critique about Mondale being young and maybe even turned this kind of age and wisdom thing into one of Reagan's strengths. NIki, did you say you played this in your big Vanderbilt history of elections class?
Yes, we talked about the history of debates, and this, of course, is one of those moments that really resonates. And the students cracked up when Reagan delivers that line, because it's just so well constructed and so funny. And that's actually, it's interesting because James Baker, who's part of the Reagan administration, afterwards says, "Oh, it wasn't a scripted line," and it was like, buddy, you might not have written it, but that was not sort of manufactured in the moment, because it is kind of if you sort of deconstruct the sentence, like it is a kind of complicated structure to get you from the question to the punchline. So I think whether Reagan wrote it or somebody wrote it for him, it was, let's call it pre-rehearsed.
But even Reagan's an actor. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like, if someone were to give him a line, he knows how to deliver it and have it land when it's supposed to. Yeah. So even if it was scripted, there are not a lot of politicians that can still deliver scripted lines and make it feel authentic and like, oh, you just came up with that. Yeah. I mean, that's Reagan's strong suit.
Yeah. So a couple other things on this, and then we'll talk about the larger age issue. But, with the 1984 election, I mean, I do think it was generally not super close all along. These were legit questions, though, the age thing. The other thing worth noting is, like, remember, listeners, like, debates used to happen right around now, And actually, there was a little wrinkle of a question in 1984 about after that disastrous first debate, was Reagan even going to do a second debate? And then they do, and then he has this moment. But, the history of so many elections, basically up until this one, are that, like, these debates happen, 10 days out, 12 days out, and they really reshape things. And we are now sitting in this moment where there's just not seemingly anything that we can anticipate that's going to be a sort of moment of mass attention that could potentially lead to one of these moments, which I think probably both sides thought was in their favor. But now I'm curious. I wonder if the Harris campaign in this very moment is sitting there going, gosh, I wish we had another debate. But what is our sense of whether this line actually kind of shifted? I mean, can we draw a direct line between this quip at this debate and the fact that then there is a massive, massive blowout in the election 10 days later? Reagan gets almost 60% of the popular vote, wins all but one state. I mean, it's pretty intense.
I mean, I hate to say things are like a foregone conclusion or inevitable or things like that, but I'm pretty sure people would have voted for him regardless. Like, I don't know. I mean, I would have to see like the poll numbers and, like how many people watched the debate and how many people talked about it and sort of like had it changed their perceptions. But for the most part, especially that close in, people know what they're going to do. Yeah. You know what I mean? You would have to really do something catastrophic. There would have to be some sort of medical doctor that says, no, we deemed him unfit. You know what I mean? For it to really have that kind of power.
Yeah, I could see, like, if Reagan had come back for the second debate and had another abysmal performance, that it might have shrunk the margin between Mondale and him. But man, we are talking about, gosh, nearly 20-point spread and 49 states. Like, maybe it would have been 47 states. But I think that, this was not a close race, and this is not the kind of race that a debate, no matter how disastrously he had performed, would have done much to change the outcome of.
Correct.
I do think, too, we tend to give people some grace when they fumble. Like, I mean, listen, I'm not old and I forget things all the time. I fumble things all the time. I'm always scatterbrained. But I mean, there's some element, I think, of grace. They're like, oh yeah, okay, we all do that. I think it's if we were to see it, if we saw it with Reagan on a consistent basis over a prolonged period of time throughout the campaign, that might have been more of a game changer.
Right, which means, that different media environment maybe played a little in his favor at the time. All right, so thoughts now. I mean, we've talked about this. We talked about this, on our Sunday episode a little bit about the age question, and particularly, I think, very legitimate and I think slightly kind of rising questions about Trump's age and mental fitness. Something you just said, Kellie, about the sort of sympathy we find for folks. I mean, I'm not seeing that necessarily in Trump, and I wonder if there's something about kind of the distinction between, like, mental unfitness and frailty, because for all of the problems that Biden presented, there was a little bit of a sympathy there. I don't think it was going to, be enough to carry him through the election, but there was a little bit of like, oh, this old man, let's cut him a little grace or whatever. I'm not seeing that with Trump. I'm seeing more just kind of like fears that he is becoming a little more unhinged. I don't know. Thoughts on that, and then thoughts on whether it will feel like it'll enter the conversation even more and potentially, I mean, this isn't going to be a blowout, but,
What you just said about
Deep
like
sighs all
that
around.
his
Sorry.
the idea that his age doesn't make him seem frail, but makes him seem just even more out of bounds is one of those things where like it doesn't change the fundamental perception of Donald Trump. And I think that that's why one of the reasons why we're not seeing a lot of mobility. But the other thing, and I think this actually goes back to the sympathy question as well, the way that our politics work now is very different from the way that they worked in the 1980s, that there isn't a lot of room for grace in politics. It is not even just like a blood sport, but there is a real sense of enemies clashing, and that if you show this is especially true on the right, but like if you show any sense of compassion, then that is showing weakness, and the other side doesn't deserve compassion or empathy or sympathy, and so there's just not a lot of room for that in our politics today.
You know who I see that with the strongest is, the governor of Texas, Abbott, who's in a wheelchair. And I was just talking to a friend a couple weeks ago. She's like, he's in a wheelchair. Yeah. I was like, yeah, he's in a wheelchair. She was like, I had no idea. And it's like, because Abbott, for better or for worse, projects strength and people forget that he's disabled. They forget that he is in a wheelchair. He has this persona that overshadows his disability in a lot of ways, to the point where people don't even pay attention to it. I've never heard robust discussions about Abbott and his wheelchair. But the way that we think about strength and the way that we think about Trump, I think there's a lot of that too. As long as you can show that you are a bully or strong or unflappable or whatever it is, it will overshadow sort of other things that people might need to pay attention to.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's wrap it up. I mean, I do think, this was the last kind of, I think, genuine blowout in American politics. There's all sorts of reasons. I don't think we'll see that for a long, long, long time. But by the same token, I mean, if this debate moment from Reagan kind of made it go from big blowout to super overwhelming blowout in an election that's as close as the one like now, something that moves stuff by a few points might actually have an effect. But I just don't know if we actually are going to see that in the next 10-ish, 12-ish days or whatever it is. But let's leave it there. We will continue to revisit some election moments from the near past and the deep past, and then continue to do our Sunday election specials. I'm glad people are tuning into those. We really appreciate all the feedback on that. But we leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Radiotopia.